It is my absolute honour to be comparing the panel this afternoon. I'm incredibly excited. We've got I'm also really excited that it's just turned out. We've got 4 really brilliant women up the front, and I always think that's a good sign. Starting with Kristy Baker from Commonwealth Treasury, Jenny, who you heard from this morning, and Professor Sharon Bessell from ANU. What we wanted to do today, and I just thought it was so fantastic to start the day with stories from the front line of what the failure of this system actually looks like, so that what we're speaking about is bedded down in the reality of our lives, the lives of people we know, the lives of people in our family and our community. And Margaret Thatcher has been quoted a lot this morning, as she should have been, the mother of neoliberalism. But the interesting quote from her was where she actually said, neoliberalism was never about the economy. It was always about hearts and souls. It was always about changing the hearts and minds of the British people. And I would say in that sense, mission accomplished. And I think it's important for us to remember that as we look at what works and what doesn't work. Before introducing everyone, about 20 years ago, I worked at the Financial Review, and I had the good fortune of, in our pod, there was 6 journalists, and on my left was Peter Harcher, and on my right was Tony Harris, who is the former New South Wales Auditor General. And the 3 of us talked all the time and did very little work. And in those days, you didn't have to do much work as a journalist. It was great. But we talked a lot. And one day, Tony came in and he was all huffy and puffy. And he said, you know, I've just realised, those old enough to remember will know what he was talking about. He said, do you know the Exxon Valdez disaster in Canada, where the Exxon Valdez was an oil tanker that ran aground, flooded the Canadian coast with oil and destroyed the economy, the local economy, destroyed the wildlife, really trashed the joint. He said that event drove up GDP. That was good for the Canadian economy. And Harcher, never to be outdone on anything, said, oh, that's not it. Don't worry about that, mate. A crime wave will drive up GDP. And Tony goes, what do you mean? He goes, well, crime wave, right? So everyone goes out and buys security systems and grills on the windows and, you know, GDP goes up. And so from then on, it became a bit of a race to see who could find the most scandalous, socially destructive thing that was good for the GDP, which went on for about a week and became very boring. But after a week, the 3 of us decided that obviously the GDP is a complete crap indicator when it comes to telling us how we are going as a community in our well-being. It is a bad indicator, but it was the only indicator. So we decided, being clever kids, we would just design our own. I mean, how hard could it be, right? An alternate indicator to measure well-being in the Australian community. And at the time, Tony Blair, the UK Prime Minister, had just announced that he was going to do the same thing. He was going to develop 14 headline statements that indicated well-being, and every government department would have to make any decision they made against these 14 headline statements, which lasted about 18 months before, one thing and another, we all got busy, that got ditched. And our own little endeavours revealed how incredibly complex this thing is. It has taken us hundreds and hundreds of years of the most powerful factions in the Western world to develop the economy as we understand it today, with the finesse of it, the complexity of it. It turns out that 3 bored journalists couldn't actually change that in 12 months. And eventually Tony got unwell, I lost my fight with the editor, and Peter jumped ship and went to the SMH, and the rest is history. Except fortunately, it's not history, because today Kristy is going to speak about our re-emergence into this space and what it looks like to have an alternate indicator. We'll go through, I've asked everyone to speak for 5 to 10 minutes, then we'll have questions, and we're really also hoping for discussion, because this is, again, it's an emergent field. We heard this morning how critical all of these things are. This is, you know, as my colleague Michael said over lunch, this is probably the most important conversation we can be having in Australia in terms of fixing so many multiple wrongs that we really need to start giving it the weight that it deserves. So I shall briefly shut up and hand it over to Kristy Baker. Thank you very much.
Thanks everyone, and it's so wonderful to be here. Having some brief chats before we reconvened, it's obvious that this morning was a really, really powerful session. And I'm so glad that the day started with some real lived experience, and I hope that my presentation isn't going to be extremely boring and dry as a result. But wonderful that these kind of speakers are being pulled together to talk about these really important issues. Just briefly before we get started, a little bit about myself. So as was mentioned, I'm from the Commonwealth Treasury. I've been there for just over 22 years and worked in a wide range of areas, including revenue policy, macroeconomic policy and social policy. I've been really fortunate as well to have a few opportunities to work overseas in Indonesia and Papua New Guinea, and sort of delve a little bit more into the what economics and economic frameworks can bring to development, which is quite, which is where a lot of these questions continually arise. So it's my great pleasure to talk to you about Australia's Wellbeing Framework, which is the Measuring What Matters framework. But it's not a complete solution at this stage. As was mentioned, the economy is about so much more than GDP, and we've been grappling with that. As we heard, the economy is about so much more than GDP. It has to be a collection of metrics that we measure. And this is really about thinking deeply about what additional measures we need in order to give a sense of the Australian economy and making sure that we're delivering on what people really need and what they value. I think what they value is very important. When we try and measure what people value, we start to, we inevitably face challenges. One of the things that that I'll just mention as an example with this framework was, how do we measure the importance to people of culture? That's an ongoing challenge that we haven't yet cracked, but it's something we're very conscious of. So without further ado, I might sort of launch into the presentation. We're going to have questions and things afterwards, but please, if you have a burning question, I'm very happy to be interrupted at any time. So we might just go to the next slide. So the government released their first wellbeing framework, Measuring What Matters, in July last year, to help better track outcomes in the economy and society. We intend to use the framework to tell us how we're tracking against key indicators, where we're doing well, where we're doing not so well, and where we can do better. And we will certainly not be using these as a substitute for GDP and unemployment, inflation and those traditional measures of the economy, but these are designed to give us a richer picture. Go to the next slide, please. So I'd just like to talk a little bit about the process that we undertook. So the development of this framework really started in earnest in October 2022. We went through the normal process of sort of undertaking a literature review and talking to a number of international colleagues about their frameworks, and you might be familiar with some of them. Wales is has quite a famous model. The OECD has a model. We also talked to New Zealand, who has quite a developed and integrated model. But we were really conscious that we couldn't just sort of pick pieces from those models and assume that they would be a good fit for Australia. So we had to undertake a series of consultations. So we started with public consultation, I think it was in February 2023, and we got over 160 submissions from the community. And as we worked through those submissions, some key themes started to emerge. But we knew that we didn't quite have enough information at that stage, so we went back out for a further round of consultation. And as part of that process, we ran an online survey that really sought to gather more disaggregated information on the various themes that were emerging. As a result of those collective rounds of consultations, we engaged with more than 272 businesses, community groups, individuals, and we also encouraged parliamentarians and community groups to run roundtables and town hall type events to sort of also check how people reacted to different views in group situations. As a result of that process, we distilled down to 5 key themes, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, but our ultimate aim was to end up with a framework that was informative but sufficiently simple that all aspects of the community could engage with it. So if we can go to the next slide. So the framework consists of 5 themes: healthy, secure, sustainable, cohesive and prosperous. Within those 5 themes, we've broken down to 12 dimensions which explore various elements of those themes. And from a measurement perspective, there's a total of 50 indicators that sit across this framework. Now, many of the indicators will inform more than one theme or more than one dimension. For instance, we have a making ends meet metric, which would inform the prosperous theme, but also the security theme from a financial security perspective. And on collecting this data, we then produce 2 products: a dashboard, which is updated annually, and it can be interacted with, used for some levels of disaggregation. In some cases, we can look at certain geographic areas, gender breakdown, breakdown by income cohorts, and those sorts of things. And in addition to the dashboard, we have put out a Measuring What Matters statement, which is an analytical piece that looks at various themes and emerging trends across the economy. The government's yet to decide how frequently it will do the statement, but it is a much deeper analytical piece and likely to be done on a multi-year, so potentially every 3 years, 3 to 5 years, possibly coordinated with other major pieces of evidentiary reporting like the intergenerational report. If we could go to the next slide. So a little bit about improving the framework. So the 2024-25 budget, which we've just seen, made a major investment in social statistics. This was absolutely imperative to us being able to utilise this framework in a meaningful way with contemporary and up-to-date data. So one of the criticisms that we did face with the release of the report was that our statistical data was in some cases quite out of date, which is just a function of how often the statistics are produced. But it was quite critical because there were some significant events, as everyone's aware of. We had COVID, and then we had moved into an environment of high inflation. So a lot of the statistics that we had undertaken to look at in depth were somewhat out of date, and we had to supplement with more contemporary data to try and get the best possible picture. So the budget reinstated the General Social Survey, which will mean that we will have an expanded range of social data that we can draw on annually in order to make sure that the statement is as informative as it can be. There are other enhancements being made to the General Social Survey that will assist with greater levels of disaggregation. So communities can pick up the framework, apply it to their circumstances and get real meaning from it. we saw that as a real commitment from government that they wanted to continue to develop this framework and make it really useful, not just for government but for the broader community. So we might just move on. So in terms of where to from here, the framework was our first iteration of sort of trying to add some quantitative data to what is often a qualitative discussion about wellbeing. Just like other countries, we fully anticipate that we're going to need to refine and develop the framework as we go. And we hope to do that through sort of continuous engagement with groups like yourselves, who can potentially elevate now understanding what's useful about the framework and how it can be integrated into a range of different policy processes. So we have basically 3 key areas that we're pursuing with the framework now: how to embed the framework into government decision making, improving the framework, of which that budget measure was a very significant first step, and ongoing engagement with the community. So I might just talk a little bit about embedding the framework and what we're doing there. So some people may be aware we have a very important document within government, the Budget Reporting and Processing Rules, the BPAWs, which sets out everything that we have to consider when we're developing policy and how we have to do that. So there's been a whole range of guidance material added into those rules around the consideration of measuring what matters themes. And in addition to the need to consider those things, we've produced a large amount of guidance that's drawn on international best practice, both domestically and internationally, to try and make sure it's as usable and has the greatest possibility of improving policy making. In addition to the front end of policy development and trying to make sure the framework is used as well as possible, we've also been doing a lot of work with the Australian Centre of Evaluation to talk about how we can include these kinds of metrics that influence wellbeing as people assess what has been done and seek to improve the effectiveness of policy as well as the policy directions that are taken. We've also realised that wellbeing requires collective effort. So we're at the start of our wellbeing journey. We've introduced a framework. Now we want to learn from the community how to make it better and collectively work towards improving Australia's wellbeing. If we could go on to the next slide. So we're drawing heavily on the public sector. We've set up a range of engagement processes within government and within our state and territory counterpart governments. But we're also working closely with international partners and the research sector to try and make sure that we have input from the broadest range of groups as possible. But this just gives a little bit of a sense of some of the reactions that we've had. So the Mandarin and the Canberra Times both highlighted that measuring what matters signalled a public service reset, powering up with profound implications for the sector. And this sentiment was echoed internationally and within the research sector, who all recognised that this was a process to get behind and try and collectively support to see if we could have meaningful change in the way that policies developed. We recognise that there will always be considerable difficulty in measuring wellbeing. That's something that we know has been something that's a lot of people have thought very deeply about. I think it's important that we keep going and that we keep iterating and drawing on the respective experiences of everyone. And John Hewson made a really good point that a broken ruler is better than no ruler at all. And the richness that's added to policy discussion by simply attempting some form of measurement and assessment really does take us forward. So I'm going to stop there but look forward to the discussion section of the program. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Kristy. I forgot to introduce you. My apologies. There was a fabulous American academic, Wendy Brown, who writes really compellingly about the impact neoliberalism has had on the American culture and education. But she also makes the point that probably one of its greatest triumphs is that it has completely impoverished our language and our imagination to even talk about other ways of being as a community, other ways of managing an economy, and giving us back language to talk about it. And you know, the work that you're doing really begins to put you know, flesh on the bones for us to imagine what a good economy would look like for us. And given that I think we're starting from such a depth of impoverishment in that department after 30 years of having it all taken apart, you know, it's really critical. It's really critical, and it's thrilling to see you doing it. Our next speaker is Jenny Stanger, who we spoke to this morning. I will introduce you. I won't forget this time. Jenny assists Catholic organisations in Australia to respond to modern slavery. This includes compliance with Australia's Modern Slavery Act, policy advocacy, victim survivor support, survivor leadership support, and awareness raising. She represents ACAN on the Australian Government's National Roundtable on people trafficking and slavery. Jenny's been appointed to the advisory panel of the New South Wales Office of Anti-Slavery Commissioner. She established and operated Australia's only refuge and case management service in Australia for 10 years. Jenny has also consulted for the US State Department Office to monitor and combat trafficking in persons, and the United Nations in Myanmar, Fiji, Tonga, Kiribati, Malaysia and Mexico. Thank you very much, Jenny.
Thanks, everyone. Super fascinating. I'd never heard of this, so I'm super excited to learn more about it. And thanks for the introduction, and thanks to JPO for including us today. And I hope you enjoyed hearing from Moe this morning. I think it's a real rare opportunity to be able to hear from a survivor of modern slavery who's experienced modern slavery here in our country. So I hope that that was valuable to you, because supporting survivors to be leaders is also a big part of the work that we do. So I'm going to just quickly run through with you, and I put some materials on the table, what ACAN is, the Australian Catholic Anti-Slavery Network, and talk to you a little bit about what we're doing nationally, which I guess I would say is trying to contribute to a better economy for everyone. And be happy to answer some questions later. So in the interest of time, I think I'm going to zip through, and I might not do all my slides, but you've also got takeaway things if you would like. So just to give you a sense of who's in the building, who's here in the Archdiocese of Sydney. So the operational team for ACAN are the folks here. Moe is a paid part of our team as well. We do have staff sitting in Melbourne and Adelaide, and maybe soon we'll have someone up in Brisbane. But we are a team that kind of act as an internal resource for about 50 Catholic entities nationwide to help them address modern slavery. And obviously, we take a lot of inspiration and direction from Pope Francis, who, if you don't know already, he has been quite an amazing advocate for tackling issues of modern slavery globally, and he continues to do that and to call for action, not just from everyone else, but from Catholic organizations around the world. And we always love his quote about an economy of care. Moe mentioned this a little bit today, but I think it is staggering to think that there's 50 million people in slavery right now as we speak. Probably even more shocking that 41,000 is the number that we have for Australia. The Australian government, in all of its efforts over 20 years, really has uncovered maybe around 1,000 people and officially recognized only about 1,000. So there's a huge gap to address here, and You in the room might be someone who could encounter someone in modern slavery in your community and be the person that can lead them to a free and different life. Modern slavery affects women and girls overwhelmingly, and the Anti-Slavery Commissioner for New South Wales has come up with a number. He thinks that out of the 41,000 people in slavery in Australia, about 16,000 are here in New South Wales. Again, hard to measure. And Moe kind of talked about it a little bit today, but we're not talking about a bad job. We're talking about a bad job that someone can't leave. And that's because they're being forced, they're being manipulated, they're being lied to, there's threats or violence that is being used to keep them in that situation for the benefit of someone else. The reason that we have this national response to modern slavery is because in 2018 the government passed the Modern Slavery Act. I mean, I think it's kind of crazy that we're having to pass legislation and have anti-slavery commissioners in this day and age, but that's where we're at. So in 2018, the government, after long years of advocacy, and also to Moe's credit, Moe was the public face of the advocacy for the Modern Slavery Act. So the law was passed, and Section 16 of the Act requires large organizations in Australia, which includes nonprofit organizations, to comply with specific criteria to assess and address the risks of modern slavery in their supply chains and operations, and then to report on that to government. So this is not about the charitable part of what goes on in the community to help people. It's not about what Vinnie's does on the ground. It's not about what health and aged care services are doing. This is about how organizations spend their money on goods and services and to de-risk those supply chains. So the Act captures the largest Catholic organizations in the country. When the Act was passed, we here in the Archdiocese, we realized as part of our work, now there was only 2 of us at the time, plus John McCarthy, who's appointed by the Archbishop to lead the Archdiocese anti-slavery work. At the time the Act passed, we realized most of the Catholic entities didn't know that they had obligations to de-risk their supply chains and then to do the reporting. Long story short, we have managed over the years to cobble together ACAN, which is national. These are all of the participating entities in ACAN. So you can see we've probably got 95% of the largest entities in the country participating. And yeah, it's been a monumental effort to get everyone to work together. But if we can work together, then we have a lot more leverage and influence and a bigger voice, and we can speak as one voice. So these are the current participants. Just to give you a sense, and this is in the little booklet you can feel free to take away, we're talking about almost $30 billion of revenue across this network. 9 billion of that is spent on goods and services. So not the staffing, but the stuff that we buy to deliver the services and do the work that we do across the country. It's about $9 billion that we spend. And we spend that with almost 160,000 suppliers across the country. And those supply chains are extensive. They're not all here. Obviously, they're global supply chains. And then just to give you a sense, you all know, but I don't think this information has ever been put together before. But this gives you an idea of what's the Catholic footprint look like across all these big entities. And imagine if we could get all of that moving in one direction towards de-risking our supply chains from modern slavery. I'm not going to go over this, but this is our Modern Slavery Risk Management Program. These are the tools and resources and expertise that we help the entities that are participating in ACAN to internally deploy. And it's an ongoing process to monitor risk and to take action to de-risk our supply chains and operations. It's important to remember that modern slavery is not just an overseas issue, far away. That's why Moe and people like him, his voice is so important, because it is about people that we can see every day on site, maybe even cleaning this building. So it's not just about overseas, it's about here. So these are the kinds of tools and resources that we make available to all the ACAN participants to start to tackle these issues with regards to how they're spending money, which is largely public money as well. Most of the entities have a modern slavery working group, so that's someone appointed to get people to work together and implement a plan within their organization to do the hard work. It's actually really difficult work. Annalise is here from Catholic Care. She's the appointed Modern Slavery Liaison Officer for Catholic Care, who's really stepped up its efforts in the last year. And as I said, it's a circular, ongoing, continuous process. You may have heard over the last few years about all the forced labor, the strong evidence of forced labor of the Uyghur population in China. And businesses are leaving China because of this really difficult environment now in which to try to uncover whether or not a product has been made with forced labor. There's so much evidence, but it's becoming very unsafe to go and do audits or try to conduct due diligence in China. And so businesses are now leaving to India, which is interesting because sometimes a problem gets pushed down somewhere and then it pops up somewhere else. So the modern slavery risk management, it's not a once, you don't do it once and then set and forget. We have to continuously monitor risk because it's always changing. Just to give you an idea again of what's that $6 billion being spent on and what are the high risk things that all of the Catholic organizations buy. Well, number one, and this probably isn't a surprise, is medical devices and supplies. So obviously we've got a massive healthcare and aged care system. And then we've got building and construction, and then you can see the list. So we've got a list of probably about 23 of the top, and then this is just the kind of the top 10 or 11. But it's just to give you a sense of what are we spending our money on and what's really high risk. And then what we do is we prioritize these categories to start doing some due diligence. What does all this activity result in? So the Act requires us to report on our efforts on an annual basis in the form of a modern slavery statement. So all of the entities that are in ACAN must produce a report that gets lodged to government on a public register. So they produce an individual statement. We bundle it up into kind of a big joint document, and that tan sort of document on the table is the executive summary that sits on top of that one. And I think it's the largest report in the country. So it's about usually 800 or 900 pages. Anyway, it gets lodged on the Commonwealth's online register for modern slavery statements, and anyone can go and search that and have a look at what organizations are doing to manage and respond to this risk. And I think they're up to something like 10,000 searches have been completed on the register. So you have media, you have academics, so you have a lot of people interested in looking at this. And it really is about creating transparency. What happens when there are modern slavery concerns or when someone has found a case of modern slavery? Well, Archbishop Fisher has set up an agency called Domus 8.7, which is manned by our team. And if anyone does have concerns about modern slavery in the community, so even if someone walks into a church or if you and your parish come into contact with someone and you're concerned, you can contact us and we will help you to assess that information and what to do next. So yeah, Domus 8.7 is there. And there's also resources that you can have a look at, and I think that's also in the larger document. I just thought because you're all sort of sitting at the local level, it might be quickly good to kind of consider what does this kind of look like in my neighborhood? And most of you are probably near a school or have kids at a school or are involved in schools, and to kind of bring it to life. The point of the Modern Slavery Act is to look at risks to people, not risks to an organization or It's about the people that we're connected to through the goods that we buy. And so if we think of a school, for example, it's, the goods that we buy, the services. There are also students at risk of modern slavery, which might be surprising. There are also great opportunities to connect students through learning about modern slavery. I mean, Annalise will probably tell you, and if you kind of look out in corporate Australia now, there are standalone jobs now where the role is to do modern slavery risk management. So this is becoming a real specialist area of even sustainability. And then risks to wider people, to people in the wider school community. So school cleaners, for example, this is an area that we're looking at. Cleaners in general, right? So most, there's probably people in the room who can remember or even have an employee, a relative who might have been employed directly as a cleaner. Or, we used to employ cleaners directly. We don't do that anymore. Everything's been outsourced. And in this competitive environment of contracting for services, it often can be the wages of the workers that are shortchanged. So we don't directly employ people anymore. So when the Pope refers to, jobs with dignity, we're not always providing those, right? So look, the reality is subcontracting is the way that things have gone, and school cleaners are just one of those cohorts of people that could be underpaid. Whenever you have underpayments or poor working conditions or declining working conditions, your risks of modern slavery can go up. I won't go over this in detail, but yes, there are young people at risk of forced marriage, sham marriage, domestic work, sexual servitude, forced labor even in Australia, and child sexual exploitation. And I have worked with young people in these situations, and it may be the school is where this becomes uncovered. At the same time, we've got all of this great opportunity to educate young people. And again, in educating them to make sure that they know what to do if they find modern slavery in the wider community because they've become educated about it. And I just like this example because modern slavery can come in so many forms. This is an example from the United States where a church choir from Africa had been enslaved the whole choir of boys who went to churches every day of the week, and the churches paid for them to come and sing, and all of the boys were in forced labor. They weren't studying, they weren't being paid, their parents weren't receiving the money that they had been promised. And so, again, when Moe said hidden in plain sight, this is what we're talking about. It seems good on the surface, but when you dig a little deeper, you can find that, someone's making money off of this. So I'll just stop there because it's a big topic to cover in a very short period of time, but also because it is Laudato Si week and climate change is such a big focus for so many. There are absolute direct links between climate change and modern slavery. Climate change is displacing so many people around the world and making them vulnerable to modern slavery. So Pope Francis is so right in his, integral ecology work. So we try to draw attention to that connection. I'll just stop there because I've got way too many slides. Thank you.
Thanks, Jen. We will have discussion and questions. I'm sure we have a lot of already. The last speaker for the day is Sharon Bessell. Is a professor at the Crawford School of Public Policy at ANU. She's director of the Children's Policy Centre and co-host of Public Forum Pod. Sharon's research focuses on issues of social justice, human rights, and ending poverty, particularly as they relate to children. Sharon is recognised internationally as a leader in rights-based, child-centred research methodology and has published widely on undertaking research with children. She teaches social policy, poverty reduction, globalisation, global development, children's human rights and gender, and has won several awards for teaching excellence, in 2019, Sharon was named as one of the Australian Financial Review's Women of Influence. Good on you, Sharon. Thanks, Sharon. Thanks.
Just had a moment where I'm not sure my slides are in order, so we'll see how we go. Thank you so much for the opportunity to come and share some thinking about why we need transformative shifts and how a wellbeing approach may help us in making those shifts. And what I'm going to talk about, I think, begins or says some things that are quite big picture, and we've already heard some of those things this morning, but I also want to share with you a little bit about what children tell us. For the past 25, probably closer to 30 years, my research has been on poverty, particularly child poverty, across a number of countries. And I'm currently leading what's called the More for Children project, which aims to understand, assess and respond to child poverty in ways that are child-centred. We're doing that research in a number of countries, but at the moment we're doing it here in Australia. And to achieve those aims, we're doing research with children in middle childhood between the ages of about 6 and 12 about their experiences of growing up in contexts of poverty. In the time that I have, I want to raise and maybe go a little way towards answering 3 questions. And perhaps through the conversation that follows, we can reflect on whether these are the right questions to ask and perhaps go further in trying to answer them. So those 3 questions are, why do we need a new way of thinking? I think we've already heard a lot about that, so I'll just add my thoughts to it, but you're probably already convinced. Second, does a wellbeing economy or a wellbeing approach offer us a new way of thinking? And third, and this will be, I think, my key message to everyone, is why is ending child poverty central to thinking about wellbeing? So in the research that we're doing, we're talking to children in this very wealthy country, and we're listening to them deeply about their lives and their hopes and dreams for the future. When we started doing this research, I assumed the climate emergency would probably be the main priority for most children in thinking about the future. And you probably can't see the detail of this poster, but this says having a good life is about having a good planet. And this girl talked about people as being nits on the face of the planet, being parasites. We need to fix ourselves. But only a few children talked about climate as their priority. Only a few children talked about it at all. For children growing up in contexts of poverty, there are other concerns that are far more pressing. So a 10-year-old boy, and it's his note here, he talked about bad things of the future. And he talked about the worries that he has, the fears he has when he's an adult. He's worried he won't be able to find a job, or that job won't give him enough money to live. He's worried he might be homeless or hungry, or that life might be unbearably tough. And he worries that his future's going to look like that, because that's exactly what his present is. And other children joined in and shared similar concerns, and they explained that this sort of thing happens a lot. It happens to their parents. The children who are participating in our research are growing up in poverty, but they're also growing up in an age of uncertainty, and they're worried about what the future holds. Climate emergency, cost of living and housing crises, a rise in mental ill health among children, war in many parts of the world, and the ongoing impacts of a global pandemic. And all of this anxiety, all of this uncertainty is exacerbated by living in contexts of poverty. In Australia, 1 in 6 children under the age of 15 live in income poverty. That's about 18% of our children. You imagine a classroom. And this is based on, we don't have an official definition of poverty, this is based on the OECD definition, which is 50% below median income. In one of the communities that we're working in Victoria, just over 40% of children are living in poverty. The incidence of child poverty in Australia is partly because of a range of policy choices by successive governments at both state and federal levels since the mid-1990s, and also because we have a global economic system that is no longer serving us well. It once may have done, and Kristy made the point that growth globally has lifted many millions of people out of poverty. but that system's no longer serving us well. About 100 years ago, John Maynard Keynes suggested that whether we know it or not, ideas of economics shape our world. And this, I would argue, continues today in Australia and globally. So we've already heard a bit about this. Throughout the 1980s, we saw the rise of neoliberal thinking around the world, and we saw it in Australia too. The state began to play a lesser role, and importantly, there was less concern with equitable distribution through income taxation and transfers. Neoliberal thinking sees income redistribution as best achieved through a deregulated market. In practice, this means precarious work, lower paid work, and less certainty about the hours of work. And this has devastating impacts for children in terms of their standard of living, but also, very importantly, in terms of the time that they're able to spend with their parents. And we've also seen over a number of decades the rise of a consumptogenic society, or a consumptogenic system. And this is based on the work of my colleague Sharon Bessell. And Bessell describes a consumptogenic system as one where growth is driven by consumption, with little concern for what that means for either human health or planetary health. It is, Bessell argues, characterised by institutions, policies, business practices and social norms that embed and entrench principles of extractive capitalism and also colonialism. But the next piece of the puzzle that really matters here, and that has created an age of uncertainty, is the emphasis on individual achievement. Individuals are expected to script their own lives, but often to do so in lonely isolation without support. And individuals are expected to take responsibility for the outcomes of the decisions that they've made. And this has resulted in Australia and in many other countries in people being blamed for their own poverty. Instead of examining the structural drivers of poverty, poor policy decisions or systems failures, we tend to turn the focus towards individuals who are not only blamed but often shamed through public narratives and punitive conditionality attached to government services and benefits. And in recent years, we've seen the rise of 21st century capitalism, which has concentrated wealth and prioritises value extraction rather than value creation. And it prioritises value extraction for the few above the many. And these developments are devastating for the low-income households that we've been working with. Financialisation, consumption and individualisation have resulted for many families in very high levels of household debt. And combined, this creates a context where child poverty becomes entrenched. And even if we increase incomes for people who are living in poverty modestly, the systems that prevent us from ending child poverty in all its forms remain. Children and their families become trapped. And so we're caught in a structural trap where systemic and structural factors remove children from the picture, and in doing so, create conditions for what we describe as structural child neglect, and as a result, child poverty. And so I would argue we need a new way of thinking. The Wellbeing Economy Alliance, which is part of the global movement for thinking differently about what we value and how we structure our economy, gives us two useful definitions to work with. They define an economy, I should say, very simply as the way we produce and provide for one another. It is simple, but it is useful. And they define a wellbeing economy as designed to serve people and planet, not the other way around. In a wellbeing economy, the rules, norms and incentives are set up to deliver a quality of life and a flourishing for all people in harmony with the environment. And we aim to do that as our priority and by default. This is in stark contrast to what I've just mapped out, the rather unfortunate situation that we find ourselves in globally, whereby the rules, norms and incentives are not serving us well. I think the work that Kristy just described that is happening being driven by Treasury around a Measuring What Matters framework is a really important piece of this. It's potentially the beginning of us thinking very differently. And so I think we can't underestimate the value of that work. The one thing that I would say is that as we do that kind of work, we need to ensure that we're not driven by the measure, that we use the measure to think very carefully about what it is that we want to achieve and what we want to transform. So I now just wanted to come to my final question. Why is ending child poverty central to a wellbeing economy or a wellbeing approach? And I pose that question because very often, and we see this in many places, not in Wales actually, but globally, we often see discussions about wellbeing not thinking explicitly about child poverty. But before I get to that, I wanted to share just a little bit of what we've heard from children. Based on the experiences the children have shared with us, we've developed a multidimensional framework for understanding, assessing and responding to child poverty. And that framework has 3 dimensions. The material basics, so things like secure housing, having secure food and not being hungry, having transport. Opportunities for learning, development, play and participation now and into the future. And strong and supportive relationships. And here we're focused on the ways in which poverty places often unbearable pressure on the relationships that children value most, relationships with their parents, and the ways in which punitive policies exacerbate that pressure. When children grow up in poverty, they experience deprivation in all 3 dimensions. But what is that like? And I wanted to share with you this quote. It's powerful, but it's not uncommon when we look at the experiences children have described. So in describing what it's like to live in poverty, a 12-year-old boy explained, when life is tough at home, it's anger, heartbroken. Feels like pain is in the air. Devastation is everywhere. You can see it through people's eyes. It's so frustrating, but it happens sometimes in life. It hurts. It hits you in a way you don't want it to. It normally causes people to argue, and you get hurt or no one helps you. It hurts you inside. It's a 12-year-old boy that told us that. And so my final point is that as we explore and advocate for the kind of transformation that a wellbeing economy offers, we must scaffold that by ending child poverty. And we can do that in this very wealthy country. If we don't do that, a wellbeing economy is likely to have an upward gaze. It may benefit some, but it will not benefit those children who, in their own words, are struggling or doing it tough. It won't lead us towards addressing the core aim of the Global Sustainable Development Goals, which is to make sure no one is left behind. The promise of a wellbeing approach will be hollow if it does not respond directly to poverty and particularly to child poverty. It won't serve us well if it does not explicitly aim to remove the pain from the air so the 12-year-olds can not simply breathe, they can thrive. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Sharon. I remember Ted Turner once, many years ago, donated $2 billion to the UN, and I had the chance to interview the woman who he'd employed to spend the $2 billion, or who was responsible for it. And I said, what are you going to do with the dough? Who gets it and how do you dish it out? And she said, we target girls 12 to 14. That's what we do, that's our job. And I went, what happens if you do that? And she said, if you target a girl 12 to 14 and give her the resources she needs for an education, for health, and puts off getting married for every year, you change her entire community. It is the most effective way. And I said, really? And she said, yeah, plus it makes them really happy. And I thought, good enough, good enough. The extraordinary presentations from all 3 of you. We are so grateful. Just one more round of applause. I'm really aware that I've done a lot of talking and probably other people want to jump in. So if it's okay, we might go straight to any questions or points of discussion that you want further illumination around. I have a question for Kristen. starting with the panel.
How does the community connect into the survey? Like, can you explain how, you talked about this, the Wellbeing Survey and the framework and working with community. How do we connect into it or contribute to the metrics?
Yeah. That's a great question. So, as I said, the framework sort of has two elements. It has a dashboard, which is essentially the statistical housing, and then we have a statement, which is a deeper piece of analysis that we periodically do. And interestingly, one of the future topics that we've been thinking about has been a cross-cutting analysis of children. So in terms of, but essentially what we're creating is an evidence base in lots of respects. So we've had, so it's freely available, anyone can access it and interact with it. And we've had lots of requests from local governments, corporate groups, to sort of discuss how it can be incorporated into their governance processes and their philanthropy or whatever else that they're doing. In terms of engagement, structured engagement and discussion, it's really participation in groups like this. So, you know, I think that's a fantastic question, because maybe we need to do something that's a little bit more continuous in terms of having the ability to sort of collect views in a more ad hoc way or a continuous way, so that we can capture the changing perspectives of the community. But I guess as we more effectively start to build the framework into broader policy making, hopefully there is a sort of raindrop effect or ripple effect, in that as all of those policies and all of those initiatives are interacting with the public, the framework will kind of be centred into those discussions. That's certainly what we're hoping to do as we interact with our sort of state and territory counterparts and our international counterparts, but also increasingly with the private sector and industry groups who are looking to sort of try and incorporate the framework into their work as well.
So in a sense, Chris, it sounds like potentially this the development of this new indicator is a form of developing some soft power that community can use as an evidence base for making funding requests and saying we need services. And
so one of the things we're really excited about is the sort of organic way in which the framework has been taken up. So the government has resisted to date making it somehow compulsory, because the fear is that when you do that, you sort of stifle the genuineness of the engagement with the framework, and it becomes a check the box type exercise. But we've had some really great conversations where we've worked with various agencies to develop things like the National Strategy for the Care and Support Economy, the Early Years Strategy, the National Housing and Homelessness Plan, like those things that are so central to every aspect of wellbeing. It's really been wonderful to see those responsible for those policies really embrace the framework.
Right. Can I just ask each of the panellists to reflect on everything we've spoken about today, well, in this particular segment of today, underpinning it is the kind of belief that if we get the evidence, if we have the information, then we will get a change of policy, we'll get a change of heart. We haven't really talked about where this kind of thinking intersects with a kind of tooth and claw of politics and the kind of tooth and claw of power, because we can have all the evidence in the world, we can have all the need that breaks every heart in the nation, but unless we find a way to intersect with politics in a very powerful way to change things, all of it can just drive cynicism in the end, which is a very bleak way of looking at it, but nevertheless you stick around for long enough and it kind of makes sense. So I'm just wondering, if you feel like it, I'd really love to hear from each of you on where you think the power of politics intersects with these ideas to produce change. Sharon, do you want to kick that off?
Sure. I think this is a really critical question, Julie, and I think it's about the power of politics, and I think it's also about our values and our attitudes and our beliefs as a society. And I made the point about people who are living in poverty being blamed and shamed. That is a fairly deeply embedded attitude in Australian society. It doesn't mean no one cares, people do. But we have had political narratives for a good 25 years now, maybe 30 years, that have been blaming people for their own situation. So that has an effect. So I think we need the evidence, but we also need to talk about values and how we actually have a different type of conversation. And I think that does align to the issues you raised, Julie, about power. What we really need to start to shift, or what we need to do, is to think very differently about a regulatory framework. The kinds of things that you're talking about, Jenny, around modern slavery, there's a lot that's needed there, but there needs to be a really strong regulatory framework with teeth attached to it. We need the same kind of regulation around a whole range of sectors. So, you think about the micro finance or microcredit industry. This idea was originally developed as a way of supporting people in poverty out of poverty. It's become big business. And so you have lenders that provide no banking facilities to people in poverty. They only provide lending facilities at an exorbitant interest rate. Now that needs a regulatory framework around it. There are things that we can do. But of course, there's interest in not having a regulatory framework. So I think to really get to the power of it, and this is no easy process, I do think as a community, we have to give politicians license to be able to act, those politicians that want to bring change. And that, and I think the media, Julie, you might want to come in, but I think the media in Australia is really complicit in this. We have a very narrow media. We have very narrow media ownership. We don't have deep debates about many of the issues that we should. And we see the politicisation of issues over and over again in certain interests. So I think it is beholden on us as a community to be saying we demand a different type of narrative. But I think we also need to give that licence, because while our members of parliament are continually focused on their 3-year election cycle, it's very hard for them to address these difficult issues because they're thinking about the next election. And I was really excited when the work around the Wellbeing Framework was first announced, prior to this government being elected. This could be a game changer. We saw the kind of opprobrium that was launched towards Jim Chalmers and the way he was ridiculed for trying to do something transformative. We saw big picture thinking in the first 2 budgets of this government. Wellbeing almost disappeared from the narrative of this budget. And that's because, I would say as a political sociologist, the government is currently afraid to make itself a target for an election cycle. So we've got to break that down. We've got to say we are prepared to have those kinds of conversations and not vote on the dog whistles that follow. So I don't think that quite gets to your question, Julie, because we've got big power interests at stake. Yeah. But I think it's all of those things together, and I do think as a community and as community organisations we've got a role to play in this.
Yeah, and I think too, you're dead right. If there's no regulation, if there's no carrot, particularly if there's no stick, if it's all voluntary kind of the vibe thing, Your Honour, we won't get very far. Jenny, did you have some?
I copy and paste quite a bit and just add in, migrant workers who are largely the group in Australia that's at risk of modern slavery, and temporary visa holders. The same. What's been the narrative around them for the last, 30 years? And, no one's kind of spun that around positively recently. We do have regulation, so we do have the Modern Slavery Act. It's a first step. It isn't a very toothy piece of legislation. It doesn't have penalties. It doesn't have really strong consequences yet. But we always knew that from the beginning, and at the beginning, strategically, it was always about culture change. Now, if we just look at the Catholic organizations that are complying with the Act, you know, the things that we are asking them to do and helping them to do to comply with the Act were not really being done before, and they wouldn't be done if there wasn't an Act. So we're starting here. We're trying to get people past, get the entities past a foundational level. There's been a review of the Act conducted, and the teeth are coming. The stick is coming. And what we want to do is make sure we're equipping Catholic Australia with all the billions of dollars that they have to be able to do what they need to do that they wouldn't have done without the legislation. So, I mean, Annalise could probably back me up on this, that, I'm a believer in regulation. I mean, to be able to front up all of our own people with a document that says you must comply with this, it's not voluntary. And then we build from there. So it's hard because, you know, we want to go, you know, Moe will say we need to go further faster because, you know, he's on the front line. We need to go further faster, and it is hard for this incremental thing like that we're waiting for in our space. But we just keep going. The funny thing about the anti-slavery issue is nobody's anti-slavery. Yeah, it generally brings all sides of the political.
We're very pro-slavery.
And that was my experience. So I did the same work in the United States, where they're 20 years ahead of us. But yes, you had all parts of the political spectrum coming together on this. But then it's about what are you actually resourcing, you know, what is actually changing on the ground.
Great.
So.
Thanks. Kristy, before we go to questions, did you want to comment on any of that?
Yeah, and obviously being within government, I'm a little bit constrained, but I don't think it's controversial to say that if there is, you know, widespread community interest in something, that the government will continue to direct attention to it. So I think that's a really important reason why we can't sort of step away from things like the wellbeing framework. We really have to keep an emphasis on it, and you know, the sort of combined work that you're both doing like adds to that considerably. I also just wanted to make a point about regulation. I really do agree that it's necessary, but the design of the regulation matters. And I think a couple of things that we saw in this budget sort of emphasise that. One of the things was the changes to the carer payment, which has, you know, quite a bit of rigidity around it to make sure that people who are receiving that payment are genuinely caring and genuinely have caring responsibilities. So it wasn't a big spending measure, but it was a measure that changed the regulations so that people whose caring responsibilities might be a bit more, might vary a bit depending on the carer's needs, could re-engage with work or volunteering or study more easily and less punitively in terms of what it meant for that payment. So there are small ways that we can use regulation to maintain integrity, but also help people stay connected with those processes that we all agree are so valuable within the community and within the economy.
Peter.
Firstly, thanks for your presentation. Greatly appreciate it. And I think the concept of looking at a wellbeing economy is really crucial. My concern is where that actually leads to, because, you know, neoliberalism says, well, the government has indicated all these problems. Now we'll hand it over to the private sector, to not-for-profits, to step in and solve them. We'll make all the legislation, for example, in the NDIS. I think COVID demonstrated to us that there is a place for big government. You know, they said stay at home, and we all were obedient and all stayed at home. So could you just speak to how you believe that work between government, private enterprise, not-for-profits actually helps to solve some of these issues?
That's an easy one. Kristy, do you want to?
I'm happy to kick off. I think that the answer to that is that, an answer to that is that the problems that we're facing are increasingly integrated and cross-cutting. So in policy making, what we're finding continuously is something that might have been handled by the education portfolio can't be now. It has to be handled by the education portfolio with input from health and DSS to provide wraparound services, and I mean, climate change is a wonderful example. It can't just be done within the relevant department, because there are financing issues that transcend the financing sector. So my answer is that I think solutions are going to be increasingly more integrated and require increasing collaboration between government, the private sector and the community sector. One of my recent areas of responsibility has been around First Nations policy, and we are increasingly seeing the government come to grips with the very important need to develop policy in partnership with those affected by it. So I think we are going to see, and these are just my thoughts, but I think we're going to see increasingly partnership arrangements being used to address these very, very complex policy problems that we face.
Just as I've worked with Treasury before, breaking the cycle of poverty has been said for many years. So is Treasury looking at, we spend hundreds of billions of dollars on welfare, is Treasury looking at breaking the cycle? We spend so much money, but we're still not reducing poverty.
So we look at various dimensions of poverty. There's a lot of public discourse about whether we need a defined poverty measure and things. And I guess what we find is that as soon as you try and do that, you start to lose some of the importance of the way the poverty manifests in terms of the problems that people face. So the Measuring What Matters framework, for instance, does include a number of metrics that measure different dimensions of poverty. So we're certainly very interested in how we reduce income inequality and increase outcomes for all people, but it's a cross-government, multifaceted approach that's needed. But we do hope that things like this raise in people's understanding, with evidence behind it, where some of those pressure points that can really change things, and what the actual, if we're doing okay, if we're improving on homelessness, is education suffering, and are we therefore not addressing that opportunity segment quite as well? So we're thinking about lots of dimensions, but we don't have a complete solution.
I've just been told we're meant to be stopping for afternoon tea, unfortunately. But before we do that, just a quick comment from the three of you, if you like. The kind of information that we have heard today, both from yourselves and earlier today, is both inspiring and completely overwhelming. And it feels like a kind of monstrous juggernaut that it's very hard to get a purchase on. And in the end, the room is full of people who want to take action, who actually want to do something about something. So I'm just wondering if we could finish by maybe reflecting on, if we were going to do something, if in your experience there was one thing that it is really useful for both individuals but also communities and NGOs to do, what would that be? Simple question, really. But I guess I'm looking to walk away with something that is doable.
Can I really, really quickly respond to the two questions?
Yes.
So on the question of poverty, and particularly child poverty, we have been trying to address this for decades. We had some success. We think about Bob Hawke's pledge to end child poverty. The measures that government took started to see a decline in the incidence of child poverty over the following 10 to 15 years. From the late 90s and into the early 2000s, we started to see an increase again. Now, it was a slight dip, but we saw that dip and then we saw the increase. And that was because of the policy choices that were made. More generous policies were put in place following that pledge. And then from the time the Howard government was elected, we saw far less generous and far more punitive social policies. And so it's not a case that we've never had success, we actually have. But we've made policy choices that push us in different directions. And just on the neoliberalism question, the idea of GDP is relatively recent. We've only used it as a key measure for 80 years or so. Neoliberalism came about in the 1970s when it happened in Chile as a result of the coup driven by American interests, based on the work of Milton Friedman, a economist in the University of Chicago.
Sorry.
These are ideas that we can change. Oh, you're not Milton Friedman, so okay. But these are ideas. These are ideas that have changed the world, but new ideas can change the world. So these ideas around well-being and the way we can think differently are actually really important because we've seen change happen. So I just wanted to make that point because I think there is the possibility of bringing about change. The one thing that could happen in Australia that would really shift child poverty immediately would be to change the level of benefits that people on unemployment or on single parent payment or unemployment job seeker receive, and to have I think the two things that would really make a difference is minimum income guarantee. I'm not talking about universal basic income, but minimum income guarantee, and universal essential services of a high quality. Now they're big things, it can be said easily, but those two things, if we work towards them, would shift the dial really quickly. But we need to be having conversations at local level, at national level, and at the global level.
Oh, yes, thank you.
I'm just having so many buzzing thoughts. I mean, even what you're just saying, like there, I mean, Medicare has bulk billing has kind of disappeared. That's terrible. So when I see this, I go, this is American policy. Stop. Australia, you don't want this. It's a catastrophe.
Yeah.
But I guess, look, for me, I've been doing this work for 25 years. Like I said, now there are actual standalone roles and jobs where people are focused on modern slavery. That's their full-time job. When I started, first 15, 20 years of my career, they did not exist. So I think, yes, progress is slow. I'm still here. People like Moe really helped me remember why I'm here. So I don't know, just try to stay inspired. But I think in your local community, just think about what you can do. I mean, it's probably kind of annoying, but I put those little fair trade brochures on your table. If your parish is still not using fair trade coffee and tea, it's just insane. Like, how long have we had a campaign within the church to just do that? Just do that. Get your parish secretary to go do that. How are we gonna, if we can't even buy that at a parish, how are we gonna shift the purchasing practices of the largest Catholic entities? Like, we need to be doing this at all levels. So what can you do, in front of you? We had one aged care facility say that they served 150,000 cups of tea every year. Imagine if all of those cups were fair trade and what that impact would be on those communities that are part of the fair trade system. And fair trade's not perfect. It's not a silver bullet for modern slavery, but it's something that we can do. And we don't sit in a structure where the Archbishop says everyone must buy fair trade. We have a fair trade policy. Like, we don't live in that. So we need to find, use the tools and resources that are available through the Archdiocese, and just start making those changes. And maybe the Catholic entities that you're connected to, if you're interested in their modern slavery work, have a look at their modern slavery statement. Ask them about what they're doing. Annalise is here. She's part of the effort at Catholic Care, looking at how does Catholic Care, who are we giving our money to when we buy goods and services with taxpayer dollars? Do we just give it to them, or do we actually do our due diligence on them and find out if they're dodgy and they're involved in bad practices?
And just a reminder, before we bundy off and have afternoon tea, when we come back, there are 4 different working groups. One of them is, for those interested in looking at divestment. Another group is changing the narrative. How do we reimagine? Sharon, to your point, it is so important for us to put value into what we can imagine, because we've imagined ourselves into this situation. Someone thought about it, an American, and we all followed, and we got here. So we can imagine ourselves into a different way of being. And there are another 2 workshops that I can't remember right now, but Kristy, just to finish off.
I think I just agree with what's being said. I think the other, I guess what I've noticed in my career has been a real acceptance and increasingly valued the benefits of consultation and engagement with the broader community. I think to the extent people can continue to lean in, reward people who are doing it well, but like lean in and continue to advocate, that's the only way we'll get sustained attention on these issues, which are multi-generational to fix. With the best possible policy and the best possible solutions, they're multi-generational problems, I think. But yeah, I think as government sort of continues to seek to partner and engage, I think to the extent we can support that, that's important. The other thing I would say is that we are seeing a corporate consciousness in the community. We are seeing increasing engagement with large corporates who want to do more meaningful things with their philanthropy efforts. And I think to the extent we can be connected up, that we have a real opportunity to take advantage of some of that work as well, to bring a really collective approach to these problems.
Yeah. Also creates political space too for politicians to come into and actually do what we're asking them to do, you know, all of that. Okay, I'll just hand over to Michael now to close proceedings, and then we'll go to afternoon tea.